Morning, folks. Morning. How's everyone doing? Why don't I just do a normal kickoff? We'll see what happens. Folks, welcome to the 15th of May, Aries 22, 2024 working group call. This is a Hyperledger call, so the antitrust policy and the code of conduct are in effect and are in the wiki notes. The link is in the chat for the agenda. You're welcome to add whatever you want. Don't worry if you don't see it live. It will still get saved and will be preserved. So we have a much smaller group than usual today. I don't know why. It makes me feel like I've missed a holiday or something. Let me talk about what we were going to talk about on the agenda, and then we can decide if we want to proceed with that or if we want to change given the group that we've got and talk about anything else of interest. So on the agenda today is the unqualified did CCU. I have a PR as planned from last time. I wanted to follow up a little bit on some of the other things that we talked about and just kind of see where we are. James also brought up that we should resurrect the out-of-band invitation and transition, and so I have a PR that suggests some things there, and including a title change to make it a little bit more clear. Anyway, so there's that, and then there's a VDR proxy protocol here, and for discussion, and then this gets around the firewall issues discussed last time, and then any updates on DIDCOM v2 adoption. That was kind of the planned agenda. So having said that, and we've got a little bit smaller group than usual, any votes or opinions on what we should do? Should we just continue as normal? Should we address other topics? Should we all go join the vacation that everyone else is taking? Thoughts? No thoughts?
I guess this is related to unqualified DIDs, but one of my thoughts that I came up during this week was, so we've talked about DID rotation in the past. I don't know if there's been much discussion around DID rotation and mediators and how that would be handled, especially with things like having the whole new DID Peer 2 stuff and whatnot.
That's a good conversation point, although I think there's good answers there, but we can definitely discuss those. That's a good thing to talk about. Any other opinions on how we proceed on our agenda today? We can do whatever folks think would be most useful with our time here. You almost said something, Sebastis, and then didn't.
No, no, I didn't say anything. I was just thinking, are we? Do you think we will be able to contribute to these topics when there are others who really do most of the contribution?
Uh, that's possibly not. Um,
If you
so
if you if you won't get what you're looking for out of the participation, then uh, maybe we can't discuss the topics that you had in the agenda, I suppose. Just my thoughts.
I think that's reasonable.
So I do want to mention that when you do have a smaller crowd like this, especially if you don't have your usual contributors, it makes it a lot easier for those who don't contribute to the discussion very often to contribute their own thoughts on the matter.
Also true. Okay. Well, so let's do this. Let's, Colton, you brought up a topic that I think we should discuss. And then I think we can kind of look at this, and then if anyone is interested in discussing any of these items, I'm very happy to. But I also don't feel like it's worth just sort of by rote going through things just because. So there are PRs that are worth taking a look at, and we can discuss any of those now, or we can discuss, or you can just take a look at them and we can discuss them next week. All that's cool too. But in the meantime, let's get started, Colton, with your topic. Did rotations implications on use of mediators? Any further comments you want to make, um, or thoughts, or should I share my thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, so barring the use of did web, because did web kind of helps solve the issue fairly nicely. But even with the new did web adjacent method that BC Gov came up with, I think it's still a bit of an possibly an issue in that when the mediators did changes inside of did peer 2, we're using those dids as the endpoint, which means that everybody who's using the mediator needs to update their dids after the mediator updates its did.
So from a rotation perspective, you're not talking about clients that are doing did rotation using a mediator, but the actual mediators did rotating itself.
The actual mediators did rotating itself for whatever reason.
Yeah, let's not do that. So I misunderstood what you implied first, or what your question really was. So now that I understand it better, um, for services that need to be like a long running stable thing, um, did rotation is extremely painful.
Yes,
Is
absolutely. Well, especially in the case of the mediator when it can't notify people that its did has changed.
Why would a mediator change its state? Why did you think of that?
Um, in the particular case that I was thinking of is that did peer 2 has had a bunch of improvements, and during that phase some dids that were being generated were actually invalid dids according to the did peer 2 spec. And so once those are corrected, you basically have to even if the information in the did is completely fine, you basically have to swap out the entire did. And as newer did methods come along, you might want to switch to one, say like switch from did peer to did web to, or whatever you may want, whatever the case may be. But as soon as you need to swap for whatever reason, this situation comes into play.
So this is a really good conversation. It's worth noting that you can have multiple DIDs for something like a mediator and have it still work, right?
Yep.
Um, so this isn't really a in the case that you don't really want to change them, but you need to for some technical reason, like you just mentioned. It's less of a rotation and more of the fact that you're going to add properly supported ones and more or less deprecate the old ones.
But even doing so, when you're deprecating the old ones, you need your older clients who are still using those to stop using the old ones.
Yes. So um, yes. So you can add new did for technical reasons. I think you need to monitor. Let's see, deprecate. So to discourage new use. Um, I think it's important for a mediator to be able to monitor which did was used. Um, and then there's a missing step right here, and then there's a remove the did when no longer used. And so I think the missing step here is how to communicate with those still using an old did.
And in the case of, mediators, you can't just send a did rotate message to your client saying, hey, please rotate your did or this did, because they may not have a publicly accessible endpoint and you have to wait for them to connect to you.
Right. And so it's also complicated because if a mediator says, yo, my did's changing, there's a significant amount of effort for that party to then update did docs and or rotate dids, depending on if they're using static dids or not, to use the new mediator prior to them saying like, yep, I'm done.
Yep.
And so that's a significant issue, um, and that I think needs to be. Now I get why you're bringing this up, right? Is that this is really where the magic happens, um, is how to actually communicate uh, with the party that the setup. So here's another interesting case. Let's say a mediator actually needs to. Um, let's say a mediator. Needs to change a did or the URI that's actually being used as an endpoint. Still has the same effect, right? To some degree, because if the did was being used as a static did instead of like a did web, then people can't just necessarily re-resolve the did. They have to be aware of the new one.
Yep.
And so one of the pieces of advice may end up being here that infrastructure like mediators should not use pure dids in production to identify themselves because otherwise it prevents the doc update information. Um,
Sam, is that one you could have, we could model a push notification message that is not actually, hey, you have a message to pick up. Hey, I'm doing a thing that you need to be aware of. That doesn't solve all the cases for mediation, but at least hits the mobile portion. Or given our push notification discussion on Monday, good also, I suppose. The other piece would be some of this may want to be handled actually outside of the realm of DIDCOM, and that if application developer is using a mediator, they should probably be contacted by whoever hosts the mediator, or if they host the mediator, then they should they need to coordinate with the app developers to make an update at the same time, if that makes sense. So there can be some outside world knowledge as well, which might be helpful.
Yes, it could be. And in a normal case, that's, I think, really true. In a situation where you're running something like a public mediator like Indicio does, it's a little more complicated because
Yep.
like people don't have to like register in order to use the service. That's kind of on
Yep.
purpose, except it presents the complication that you're like, yeah. So one of the interesting things here is that having a mediator changing a DID or a URI is nearly the same as the process of switching mediators. In the
Yeah,
sense,
I was just thinking of one more scenario. Is it ever possible that the database gets corrupted or hacked or something like that?
you mean like the database of registered
Yeah,
DIDs on the mediator? I mean,
yeah,
it's it's not impossible. I think it's the right answer. And so one of the interesting things that could happen is that, so keep talking. I want to know where your brain's going.
yeah. What I'm so we need to handle that situation where, let's say, the data has been corrupted or lost or hacked or whatever, and you need to restart the mediator, and you need to, like, it's like bringing the service down on which you are dependent, and now you need to reestablish things.
And when clients reconnect to the mediator, they need to, reestablish the mediation that they had,
Right.
and all of the DIDs that they had registered with the mediator for relaying. They need to re-add all those keys.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, you first.
Yeah, I was thinking if the mediator has to recycle the DID for whatever reason, it can handle the same. We can have a similar process for these different scenarios.
We could. I think the mediator changing some details to the mobile app, say, that's using the mediator, it's simpler in the sense that, like, oh, I don't need to necessarily re-register all of my keys. I just need to tell everyone else that there's new information about my mediator. But from everyone else's perspective, it's the same in the sense that they receive they receive a new DID for the party, particularly if it's a pure DID, which is a really common use amongst individuals, right? They're going to be like, oh, well, you have a new DID, and here's the mediator that's actually using. If the mediator doesn't have the ability to like update the URI and the keys directly, so that's where this possible recommendation comes in. But the issue still is, to Colton's point, how do you message to people that you're using a DID for the mediator that is deprecated?
Yeah, I think what James talked about, notification, all that assumes that I still have good data in the mediator.
It does. I think it's a really separate problem, even though I think it manifests in similar ways to some parties. I think that if I connect to a mediator and they're like, "Who are you?" when a mediator should know who I am, that's a problem. Um, so part of it is how to detect, but I think the mediator data like data loss problem is actually distinctly different from the fact that someone's using an older DID to access the mediator itself. So let's talk about them both. Um,
I was just thinking that it's to not handle too many scenarios and just deal with it in one way and force a complete reconnect. Go back to state 0 and start from there. When the DID rotate is about to happen, is you inform, you basically make a public announcement that It's like Amazon saying, I'm going to bring, or Google saying, I'm going to bring my service down. Guys, do whatever you need to do, and we'll be down for a certain amount of time, and then you can start from scratch. Because did rotate for a mediator is a major infrastructure upgrade. I think I'm not 100% sure whether it can be technically solved, because the combinations and the scenarios will be so many.
Well, let's explore a little and see if we can come up with a common thing where we just simplify it by only allowing fewer options or not. So let's keep talking, and if we can condense it, I think that reasonably, I think that that's the right goal.
A did rotate will need a public announcement,
Oh,
right?
what?
If the mediator is changing, saying that I'm moving from this particular did to another did, or I'm changing something, I think a public announcement is required, so that every participant who's using that mediator is aware of that change.
I don't disagree, but I think there's also some mechanical things that we could do.
Yeah, I was thinking that there was something that we could automate, and this is why I was bringing it up. I was thinking that there's something that we could automate so that when a change happens, even if the other parties know that it's going to happen, the mobile device can automatically figure out and resolve its own configuration changes with the new did.
Well, let's explore the possibilities here. So the original thing was when a mediator needs to stop. It's really not when they start using a did, because it's entirely possible for a mediator to have several. So the real issue is when a mediator needs to stop using a did, because then it's it wants to remove that support for whatever reason, and it needs to stop using a did. And so I think if you have a service that uses something like a did web, this is a much less common issue, and it's so uncommon that I think you could almost treat it like hey, this mediator is shutting down, you got to use a new mediator, where just re-registration is actually required. But in the case where we have some that are using pure DIDs in order to operate, I think that something else is more useful. So did
One idea,
go ahead.
one idea that I had was, right now we have the pickup protocol that whenever an agent connects, they go ahead and ask, do you have any messages for me? And I was just thinking, what if, one of the things that came back, one of the keys that came back was if there are any system messages, not necessarily like messages that are being relayed or forwarded, but messages from the mediator itself, like announcements, effectively.
Well, those would come in just like normal messages. They just come from the mediator.
My on the similar line though, my an idea here would be to add an additional message to the mediation coordination protocol that has that says, "Hey, we're updating the routing keys that we provided you in the original mediation grant." But that comes in response to getting a status message from the pickup protocol, because that's going to get sent the first time that agent connects always.
Right. So you initially brought this up with did rotation, Colton, which I think is really good. So one of the things that this has caused me to think about is what are the semantics of did rotation really? And did rotation is one party saying to another party like, "Hey, I'm gonna send you." Well, it depends on didcom v1 versus didcom v2. In didcom v2, The
The
rotation is
semantic.
it's an after the fact rotation. I mean, you just rotate keys and then you let the other person tie it together, which is too abrupt for the concerns with the mediator.
Yep.
It's too abrupt because you have to do a bunch of work. And so, as soon as you find out that happened, it would be like insanely difficult to like make that happen. The did rotate that we've pulled off in DidConv v1, which is sort of a pre discussion about did rotation, I'm less inclined to try and solve the problem with something that's going to go away anyway, in the sense that it works the way DidConv v1 works instead of DidConv v2. So I definitely think I like where you're going, James, in the sense that like we don't have a way for the mediator to past the initial setup to say like, hey, the setup needs to adjust, and they can be patient with it. They can say like, hey, I'm notifying you that this is happening, and maybe here's a deadline. Maybe I'm just going to tell you and keep repeating this to you until you fix it. But that would be a useful thing to actually have just from a top level semantic piece. And that way could be substantially more patient than a did rotate, just because of the complexities of communicating a new did, for example, of execute. It more or less causes not a cascading, because that implies it keeps going, but it causes a second order of did rotates to occur for any peer dids that you might have. And so when the mediator does in fact have to change something that isn't just naturally resolvable. So, and it is about the routing keys, James, because that is set up initially, and notifying, hey, you're using old routing keys, whatever they are, whether it's a did or it's a key or an endpoint, right? That's what comes in the routing keys configuration when you first configure mediator. And so using some sort of thing to say like, hey, I know the old ones still work, but knock it off. Here's the new information that you ought to be using, I think is a really powerful message to include, because it's kind of a updated configuration or a reconfiguration message that falls in line with the original stuff actually passed. So so looking at this is the most, yeah, okay. So you have a mediation request, here's a deny, here's a grant. The grant contains the routing did of the mediator. If this routing did was in fact something like did Weber did TDW, that's fine. They can actually just go update the information in the did document, because this is the routing did that's going to be passed to all of that entity's connections when they issue dids, right? It's going to be contained as part of it.
And one of the cases that I referred to earlier as well is the initial did that the mediator hands out could be a did peer, but then like in an update or whatnot, they want to roll out something, more stable like a did web.
Right. And I think this, obviously we can have some recommendations of what you start with, but you may need, for example, let's say it's a did web, but then you have to change hosting providers or something, right? Something that you're not necessarily changing methods, but you have some infrastructure change that is required. Then doing an update message that's like this, I think could be really helpful in order to communicate with the user like, hey, I need to update the did that you're actually using, and I realize this is painful, so I'm going to be patient with you. But that way you can keep track of that. And then the mediator can monitor use of how messages are actually arriving, whether it be to a specific URI, meaning it's some piece of infrastructure, or it comes in with a specific routing key, because of the did being present here. Then you can still make that work. So James, I think of all of these things that we've discussed today, I think your idea is the best.
Oh, dope. One of the other parts you could do with this, though, Sam, is that you have a message from the mediator saying, "Hey, this is updated." You could then have a potentially add a third variant to the key list update to say, "Hey, I'm switching to your appropriate did, routing did." And that way, the mediator could very closely track, "Hey, how many of my uh, key lists actually point to the appropriate did?" And when you hit 95%, that's when you switch over, for instance.
I think it would be better to monitor the actual arrival of messages than it would be to monitor, hey, I told all these people. Maybe I'm wrong there
Uh,
because
Not the point of that you've notified them, but that they've actually switched. So have the mobile agent notify the mediator, "Hey, I've switched all of my the keys that you're listening for. I've switched them all to point to your appropriate did. I did rotates on my end." So
say
the
that again.
mediator can,
I think I misunderstood.
yeah, so have the mediator says, "Hey, we're switching the routing did that we want you to use." The the recipient, like a mobile agent in this case, would say, "Okay, I'm going to do a did rotate on all of my connections." Okay, I'm not going to do a key list update to say, "Hey, for each of these dids with all of my connections, I have updated them to use your new routing did."
Right. So the
So
mediator could basically know who was notified of the third party connections.
Who was notified and who was actually updated, so that they know if they remove the old did, who how many of the connections will be broken.
that would be a nasty key list update. You're basically, depending on how many keys you have, you are effectively saying remove all of the. Well, no,
No, it's not. It's not bad.
no,
And
that's
you could
not.
do it in chunks, right? You don't have to do the whole thing in one gigantic update.
Yep.
Um, so if I'm going to do a key list update, so my mediator says, "Hey, I'm going to send you a mediate reconfig message." I'm making that up.
Yeah.
Um, then the then I go and I talk to all of my people. Let's say I have 100 dids. I need to execute a did rotate, 100 dids that use peer dids for me. Okay, that's or some sort of static did
Yep.
because I can't just update my did doc in those particular cases. So
Yep.
I message out to all those 100 people a did rotate, and they get my new did, and then they're presumably going to send back some sort of response to say like, hey, yep, I got it, and um, the um, the mediator would pass the new message to the new, using the new did stuff. Oh, this is interesting. If I'm going to rotate, I just realized that if I'm going to rotate a did, then I have to register that new did with the mediator. So the mediator says, "Hey, here's a reconfig, a mediation reconfig." I then have to message my um, I have to create 100 new dids for each of the 100 connections that I have. I register those new dids with the mediator because otherwise
Remove
I
the old
couldn't get a
ones.
message. Well, you can't really remove the old ones yet, just for the patience principle of other people actually getting the message and everything else. So I add 100 new dids that refer to the new mediator config. And then I message them and do a did rotate, and presumably they send a message back in via the new did. Now the mediator itself doesn't know the correlation between the old did and the new did, and I don't think it should.
Mm.
But But then there's going to be a huge keyless swap when that actually happens. There's going to be a whole bunch of newly registered DIDs because that's why you would do that. If you
Yep.
weren't going to change your DID but simply update your DID document, you wouldn't need to do a DID rotate.
Yep.
So if you inform someone of a config update, the mediator has to anticipate a huge number of new registered keys and other ones removed as part of that process. And if I was writing client software, what I would do is I would start looping through, keeping track of which ones that I coordinated with. I would do this maybe like 10 at a time, where I would send, I would register a new DID, I'd register it with the mediator. So there's 10 new ones. I send some DID rotates. I get messages back. When I get the message back that confirms it's been rotated, I can then delist the previous keys with the mediator. And I can say like, yeah, I don't need that to be done anymore because I've gotten receipts from all the people that are using that DID that and they're now using the new one, and I know that because they sent me a message. And the sending a message back is actually not something that's required currently inside of DID rotate.
Yep.
Um,
And I feel like, given the asynchronous nature of DIGCOM, I feel like it shouldn't be a requirement, and that if we send out a assuming both parties support DID rotate based off of doing a discovery, then you should be able to just send the DID rotates, say, hey, yeah, I'm updating it. So the next time you send me a message, I'm good. I
well,
feel like that's a
yes.
valid approach.
Yeah, I'd love confirmation. That's really handy. And you know what we should use for confirmation? A trust ping. You send a trust, like literally this is like what it's for, right? And so if you send a trust ping with a DID rotate, then the response should come back to the new DID. And so because you need something, you need a message to send the DID rotate with in DIDCOM v2. It's a header. Then getting the response back to the new DID is a self confirmation of that. This is in the wrong place in my notes because that implies it's the mediator. Yeah.
So one of the really cool things, I guess, never mind.
This is too long of a comment, but okay. That's actually really good. I actually really like the concept of using a trust ping with the DID rotate if you don't have some other message that you're passing. So there's two common times to use a DID rotation. One is when you're initially establishing the connection and you want to rotate off of a DID used in an invitation to then a more pairwise connected thing. And so you're generally talking about something anyway, and so you already have a message you're sending, and you can just do DID rotation alongside that initial message you're sending, and everything's fine. When you're changing your DID, and that's what we're talking about here, you may or may not have a message to send. And so if you don't have a message to send, we'll just use a trust ping because that actually accomplishes what you need. The other interesting thing is that if you don't get a response back from the other party within a certain amount of time, you might consider that to be a dead connection, like the other party is no longer receiving, which is actually the other use of trust ping anyway. And so if the other party doesn't actually respond, then in addition to saying, well, now I've told everyone about that, you can be like, and I think this is a dead connection. I could actually prune it out of my own list, or mark that connection as a dead connection because they didn't respond. And that would be interesting too. So Sebastis, you mentioned that like you really need like some sort of out of band announcement, not an out of band message, but you really need some like public message that says like, hey, I'm changing this. And I think that that's definitely required when someone's actually doing this so they kind of know what's happening. But I also really like this thing that James brought up where maybe there's a way to update the routing did initially given during a mediate grant. Because right now it's a missing piece of that protocol in the sense that there isn't currently a way to tell the other party like, hey, listen, I'm still happy to mediate for you, but I need to change the configuration I initially gave you. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to understand one thing, and I'm learning a lot about the mediator through this conversation. So it's great. Turned out to be a great call.
Yeah.
Is so we are adding one more mediate call here. Should it be? I was just thinking whether the response can go as a problem report, or does it have to be initiated by the mediator always? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Who would send the problem report?
The mediator will send the problem report saying, hey, I'm handling this, but you need to make some changes.
Problem report's pretty good, although I think the problem report should be used for exceptional behavior, not regular behavior. So here's what I mean. Let's say the mediator sends a mediate configuration update, okay? Like this new message we're envisioning based off of James' conversation. And then and the other side's like, okay, I acknowledge the config. And then like nothing happens. Like they don't actually apply the configuration change. There's no did rotates. Information is still arriving on the wrong, to the wrong did, the wrong routing did. Then I think a problem report is how the mediator says, hey, listen, you said you'd do this and you haven't yet. So
Yeah.
I'm telling you, I'm handling it, I'm still doing it, but I'm reminding you that you haven't actually, applied the config properly.
The reason I was thinking of that, I'll give you a little background of why I was thinking that, is I'm sure if we look at the mediator implementations, people download wallets, create cloud wallets and connect through the mediator, and they all become stale over time because there are not many active. And I was thinking about the comment from James that you actually go through the process, maybe at some number, he threw 95, whatever that number would be. And if you even implement the mediate reconfig call, whether there's somebody listening on the other side is a question mark. We don't know if that person is active, whether they'll do something, whether they're using the agent or not. And so that's why I was thinking, how do we do it with participants who are really actively using and are active on the system? And that's why I thought of the problem report, because we know that person is using it. We know that that person is actively using the system, and that's why. So that's the thinking I was coming from. Because whether we hit the 95 or whatever that percentage we define becomes a little bit of a unknown, because we really don't know how many of them are really active.
Totally. And a lot of them may be dead. I'm nervous about the key list update one just because you messaged all those people doesn't necessarily mean that it's there. I think what happens is when the mediator needs to stop using a did, I think they need to obviously provide a generous overlap, right? So that people have some time to transition and make that happen, because not all agents are online at the same time, et cetera. And so I don't know exactly what that threshold would be, but like weeks at least is on the order of what I'm thinking. Um, and then in that way, there's sufficient time for any active connections, but you're also not waiting so long because a lot of connections, particularly when we do our dev stuff, we end up with a lot of dead connections where like they're just not being used anymore. And I think that the system needs to just let those go in that sense. So I'm kind of inclined to just do the mediate. Well, here's this is interesting, James. What if we did a mediate config update? There's a response message from the client that acknowledges the config update.
Mhm.
And then there's another message they can send later that says, to the best of my ability, I've messaged this to all of my people. So they don't say which people they've messaged to. They just say like, listen, I think I'm done doing the config update. And the mediator is then free to mark that mediated whole relationship as like updated, and then they can use that information to decide when to like stop, supporting the old routing did. What do you think about that, James?
It seems like I think it would work. I think one of my only worries there is that does end up adding, I think that would end up adding 3 messages to the protocol for a not very often used uh, behavior, where the mediator is specifically changing their config. So I wonder if it would be appropriate for that to be, do you think that would be better to be a separate protocol that goes hand in hand with the coordinate mediation? Or do you think it should be, I don't know, that's a thought. Like I definitely think that what you just outlined would work, but so my concern is the growing size of the protocol. Is that a valid concern?
The implication, I think, I'm glad you bring it up. The implication of a larger protocol is that it's harder to implement.
Yeah.
Um, so if we made it a separate protocol, you may end up with situations where a mediator does not actually do this very well.
Mm, fair.
Um, and so now you're like, well, it's like, oh, are you a mediator or are you like a fragile mediator? Right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yep.
and maybe that's okay. If it's looped into the protocol to say you support it, then you need to support this. Um, I think if we we're doing something else like the key list update thing that you described, I think that a separate protocol would make more sense. Um,
Mm,
I um, I think the I think because this is like more core, in fact, that like, hey, like, listen, here's just a way to update the config that I initially gave you.
yeah.
Um, then I think that's fairly important. And I, I was trying to decide if this was only important to people, to mediators using peer DIDs or not. I think the obvious case is peer DIDs, but I think it's still very valid for anyone that has any other DID. Because let's say you have DID web or DID TDW, and without getting into the super big details, what if you need to change that because like the web infrastructure is changing or something? Um, like
Yeah,
heaven
or
forbid
another.
you like lost control of a domain, right? And you're like, oh crap! So you need to replace it with another domain and like enable that to still happen. That's still a useful thing that I think falls within sort of a completeness structure of coordinate mediation to say like, listen, I have to change that config I initially gave you. Because the only other real option is to say like, yeah, I'm sorry, I can't mediate for you anymore. Maybe I set up this other one over here. You can go use that, right? Which is a substantially larger deal than what we're talking about here.
Yeah, that
Sorry.
definitely makes sense. Is another example you would have like if you use like a did solve or something where you put it on a ledger and then you decide you're going to be switching all of your infrastructure to a different ledger, for instance. That would be another example in which you would want to switch a static type did to a different did.
Yes, that would be useful, but again, that is really narrowly focused on the mediators that are using static DIDs, which is not super ideal, but still important. Um, Interestingly enough, the client side piece, client meaning like say a mobile app, of this config update looks a lot like changing which mediator is used. And a robust mobile implementation, I think it's important that it's capable of changing which mediator is used without massive disruption to the user. So let's say I build a mobile app. And there's like I don't want to trouble the user with this, so I run my own mediator, or I've like purchased mediation services for the people using my mobile app. I then they're going to set up mediation automatically using that. If for some reason I want to use a different mediator, and I need to transition all of my mobile app users from one mediator to another, I have some way in my application, like say with an update that says, hey, listen, like now, it doesn't tell the user this, it says now I want to use mediator B instead of mediator A, and what it needs to do that is basically transition all the relationships from one to another, either by did-doc updates or by rotating from one static did to another one that contains the new mediator, right? Like that's something that for a robust implementation is needed. Otherwise, you can't ever change the mediation services provided. And maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe you can be sufficiently robust as long as you're willing to never change the mediator, and it's fine. But I think that the ability to change out that backend, piece of infrastructure is important for a robust system. So this change that we're asking people to do here, the implementers of coordinate mediation, of mediate, is actually something that they should probably be doing anyway. And certainly the ability to have a mediator say, listen, I have to change the endpoints you're using, I think is very reasonable.
Does it have to be?
Interest.
Does it have to be? Is it automatic at the end of my connection, or does the connection have to approve of it?
Can you ask that question again? I'm not sure I understood.
So, like you gave the example, the mobile has decided that they're going to use another mediator. So they're going from mediator A to mediator B, and it's telling mediator B, now I'm going to use B and move all these connections to B. Right? So now those connections with B have to be reestablished, right? Or the B has to be informed of the connections. B has to inform my connections that send messages to B, not to A anymore. Does that make sense?
Yes, but the mediator doesn't do the notification. The party who holds the relationships does. So if I was, let's say I'm
Right,
Alice.
right. Yeah. So the mobile is doing the notification. My question is the actual peer. So I'm connected with, let's say, connected with whosoever, XYZ is my real peer. I'm telling mediator B that inform XYZ of that send the messages to this mediator.
No, you don't tell the mediator. You don't tell the mediator that. You tell the other party directly. You say, "Hey, here's the new mediator that I'm using."
Okay. So if I tell the other object, my main question is that if I'm telling them the other party that changed the routing information, is that my main question is does that happen automatically because I'm changing the mediator, or does the peer have to approve of that change?
Well, the peer has to be aware of the change. I'm not sure the word approve actually makes sense, because if like let's say you and I have a relationship, and when we made it initially, I gave you a did and said, this is me. Here's how you communicate with me. And so you can say no if you want, but what that means is you can't communicate with me because that's like the
So
did I gave you. And so if I send you an update, you can say like, yeah, I don't like your update, but that means you can't communicate with me anymore. Like it's a little bit like phone numbers. Let's say I give you my phone number, and you're like, okay, cool, and then I tell you like, hey, I have a new phone number, and you're like, no, I don't agree with that.
Mhm.
Yeah, James had the same example. That's funny. I didn't see your note before I mentioned that.
I was going to use home addresses as my example. Like you move your house or what house you're living in.
Right. So you change your mailing address or phone number. I think the analogy is pretty similar in the sense that like, hey, like this is the number you need to reach me now. And so I think the other side needs to be aware of it, just like they need to be aware that I have a new phone number. But I can't think of a reason why the other person would be like, yeah, I'm not going to call you on that phone number.
And
Right,
it's not like they can say, no, you can't move your house. Moving
correct.
forward.
And that's why my question was, is they have no choice. They can still refuse it though. That hey, I don't want to go to your new address, or I'm not going to call you at your no. But they have no choice if they want to continue. So maybe approve
That's
is not the right word. Um, I don't know what is the right word, but there's something that's happening on the other side.
Yeah, they have to update their records. Like if you tell me a new, if Colton says, hey, I have a new phone number, like I have to change it in my address book, if you will, so that the next time I call him, I'm calling him on the new phone number. Um, and so it's an awareness certainly. The other side needs to be aware that that's actually happening for the communication to continue.
Yeah, it's like notify and accept kind of a thing.
Yeah, but there's no like reject. It's more like an acknowledge. Like
Yeah.
maybe acknowledge is the right word, where you say, "Hey, here's my new phone number," and you're like, "Okay, I got it." You're not really like approving it or denying it. You're just saying like, "I'm telling you that I received it. I updated what you're telling me," right?
Hmm.
And that's what you're thinking of for the trust ping there.
Yeah. So sending a trust ping with a did rotate is like saying like, "Oh, by the way, here's my new phone number." And if you send in the trust ping like that you're requesting an acknowledgement back, then you're saying like, oh, like I'd like to know if you got this, and you're like, oh yeah, I'll tell you that. Like, hey, I accept your, I'm acknowledging your new phone number.
It's like someone adding the new phone number to their address book and then giving it a call to make sure that it works.
Yeah, 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 right. Like texting messages, you text on the new number and be like, hey, I'm here, right? Okay, so we're totally out of time, which is amazing because we started with a really small group and then had this fantastic conversation about mediators, Colton, which I really appreciate you bringing the topic up. So at the risk of running just a little bit longer, there's a couple things that I think could come as an outcome of this. One is a proposed update, and it would probably be a new version of coordinate mediation, which I realize there's been a lot of versions of that recently, but that actually adds these features. And that way we could discuss it. The other thing is probably in the book needs some discussion about how you actually execute a did rotation. In the kind of the two common cases where that happens. One is at the beginning of a relationship. The other one is if you're changing a did. And then how that ought to be done, I think would be really useful writing to have happen. I would like to say that I could do some and I could try. I am going to be really busy the next couple weeks preparing for EIC in Europe, and so I don't know how much I'll get done. So if someone has the time, that would be amazing. If not, it'll be here in the notes, and we can kind of come back to that and then further this with any other realizations that folks have in our subsequent weeks. Thank you everyone for coming. We are over time. Um, uh, Yeah, James, if you have, that'd be awesome. Just raise the voice so we don't all like find the time randomly. Just post in the channel or something. But yeah, that would be awesome. Thanks, folks, for coming. This was a fantastic conversation, even though we mostly didn't do our agenda. So time well spent, and I'm grateful for you being here. And we will see you all elsewhere, or if not next week. Thanks, y'all.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
See you later.